Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Professor Chris Hill's Valedictory lecture. For those of you who don't know, my name is David Runciman. I'm currently Head of Department of Politics and International Studies, a role I very happily took on from Chris. This is a new departure for us, a valedictory lecture. I think it's a fairly new tradition in Cambridge. It seems to make an awful lot of sense to invite someone who is retiring from a very distinguished academic position to have a chance to reflect and draw some wider lessons at the end as well as at the beginning of holding that role. I looked up online and tried to find out when this tradition might have begun in Cambridge, and it's not clear, but you're very quickly directed to a blog post by Cambridge's most distinguished blogger, Mary Beard, called In Praise of the Valedictory Lecture, in which she says, I'm going to paraphrase, that the trouble with inaugural lectures is that people feel a little cowed by the institution that they may be about to join and a little nervous about causing offence. But the great thing about a valedictory lecture is there's no reason to feel cowed or nervous, and Mary Beard says, therefore, it's a perfect occasion for delivering a few home truths. And I don't know if Chris is going to do that or not, but I think I can say that Chris has never been particularly cowed by this or any other institution. He's always spoken with great intelligence and forthrightness and clarity about the work that we all do. For us, I think what's so timely and apposite about this occasion is that the work that Chris has done throughout his academic career, the subjects that he's made his own, they aren't just as important as they've ever been, they are more important than they have ever been. Chris has been a great writer about and teacher about the idea of the international, the subject of tonight's lecture, and we are living in a time when the idea of the international is under a lot of pressure as people pull up the drawbridge or pull up the drawbridge in their minds. Chris has written widely about the relationship, the complex relationship between politics and foreign policy, and politics and foreign policy are as complicatedly intertwined now as they have ever been. Chris has been a great scholar and student of Europe, of European institutions and European foreign policy, and we are barely 6 weeks away from the vote in which the people of this country will decide whether they wish to remain part of the European Union. Chris's most recent book was about foreign policy in multicultural societies, and we are a day away from perhaps the most multicultural city in Europe, London, choosing its next mayor, and in doing so maybe signalling that it is increasingly an outlier in its multiculturalism from the rest of the United Kingdom. These are all subjects of enormous importance, and as I say, Chris has made them his own. A valedictory lecture is not meant to be the end of anything, it's merely a goodbye, and it's just a goodbye from one role among many. Chris is at the height of his powers, his current work, his future work on migration, studying British and French decline. These are not subjects that are going away anytime soon. The formal role from which Chris will be retiring at the end of this academic year is the Sir Patrick Sheehy Professorship of International Relations, a post he took up in Cambridge in 2004. Before that, he was the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics from 1991, and he's held many visiting positions at leading universities around the world. He has been at the top of his profession, of our profession, for more than a quarter of a century. He served as the Vice Chair and then the Chair of the British International Studies Association, and in 2007 he was elected to a fellowship at the British Academy. And he recently published a very important British Academy study of Britain's soft power in a changing world. As I say, this is all extremely important work. Chris's work covers a remarkably broad range of subjects and topics. It is all written to the highest scholarly standards, and it is timely and topical now. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Christopher Hill, and the subject of tonight's valedictory lecture is What is Left of the International.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Well, follow that, really. It's an enormous pleasure to be here in a way. It's not necessarily a complete pleasure to be saying goodbye, but it is au revoir, as they say on these occasions. I hope to continue in contact with you all. I have to thank David for inviting me, of course. It hadn't crossed my mind that I would do a valedictory lecture. I've spent some of my career avoiding inaugurals, but I can't get away from this one. I thought that, mind you, I'd finished my lecturing stint in March, so when he came up with this idea, I was a little bit ambivalent about it. But it is very nice to see friendly faces and interested faces, I hope, in this subject, which is, in a way, an excuse for me talking about the things that I have been doing over my whole career, and which I rather understandably think are still important after 42 years of it. Although, when I came up with the title, I thought that you might say in your, or think in your introduction anyway, you know, what is left of the International after Hill's mangled it for over 42 years. But it's a much more important subject than that. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the students, for some of them, for giving up their revision. We're not allowed to stay here for a drink afterwards in case we disturb those who prefer to stay in their revision rather than come to the lecture, so we're going back to the ARB, I think. Thanks to Helen Williams and Susie Adcock for having organised all the logistics for this. Now, I've pondered this subject, as David has said, for a long time, but more particularly, obviously, over the last couple of months. You only get one shot at a valedictory, so I wanted to make sure I get the argument that I want to make across. But that said, I'm not going to use PowerPoint except for one slide. I'm not going to read a text, as I probably would do for a big set-piece lecture, because I want to engage with you with a bit of eye contact, if possible. The prospect of retirement ought to concentrate the mind, but of course academics and retirement have a strange relationship. There are plenty of people who've said that some of our colleagues have retired but just failed to inform the university, and that has caused problems in the past. But actually, the reverse is normally true, isn't it? People want to stay on. They're desperate to stay on. They like the universities. We have such a good life. And many people do stay on, and a university like Cambridge makes it easy, because of the collegiate system, for people to continue to be immersed in a serious and indeed enjoyable personal environment, while actually not flogging themselves to death with all the more routine tasks and managerial tasks that we inevitably have to take on. My subject. There's a huge amount to study in international relations in terms of the literature, the professional subject that quite a few of us here are immersed in, but there's even more, of course, in the world itself, the politics, the international politics. Many of you will know that we distinguish in the game between IR in capital letters, which really means the subject we do of international relations, and IR in small letters, which is international relations in the world, what's actually going on. And I want to try and say something about both of those things tonight. I've always been interested in the relationship between the domestic and the international, and therefore it's appropriate that I find myself in the last few years of my career in a Department of Politics and International Studies, yoked together rather than completely merged, as it were. And I want to talk about this issue, of, not just foreign policy actually, although I do foreign policy analysis, I suppose is what I do, but the wider issue of the frame within which foreign policy takes place. And I do this for two reasons, because international relations these days, both in its subject and in terms of what's happening in the world, are very often reduced to the domestic, or they're seen as simply another way of talking about domestic or politics in the generic sense. In fact, a recent article, which I've only come across in the last few days actually, says, by Dan Reiter, says, should we leave behind the subfield of international relations? I think only American scholars could say that international relations was a subfield of probably American foreign policy or American politics. And there's also been a lot of discussion in the European Journal of International Relations about the end of IR theory, and that really we haven't actually produced anything in IR to give to the world. We borrowed lots of concepts from other social sciences and so on. A lot of that is true, actually. And there's nothing wrong with taking concepts from other social sciences, as long as we have a problematique of our own, which I think we do, and this is the argument that I want to make tonight. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time about talking about IR theory. That would be far too narrow a subject. And anyway, I'm not really enough of a theorist to be able to do that. But then there's also the question of the real world and the impact of domestic politics. And having studied foreign policy making, I'm very interested in the domestic sources of foreign policy. But it goes too far when people seem to think that international relations is just the projection of the American presidential election or the changes in the Chinese economy or whatever. I am more convinced by the argument that domestic politics often bursts into international politics, in a famous phrase from a poem by Ted Hughes, like a hawk into a dovecot, very surprisingly causing great difficulties. But that it doesn't necessarily determine the whole shape of international relations. International relations has its own logic or illogic and its own patterns of behaviour. I was impressed by our late and lamented colleague Jeff Hawthorne's book on Thucydides, in which he describes what the Athenians did to Melos, the small island which was really no strategic threat to Athens at all, in terms of the need to demonstrate at home in Athens the power of the Athenians' war machine. And that I think Jeff describes it largely in terms of the famous concept of hubris, which is not, of course, unknown in our own time in the foreign policies of the powers. So domestic politics is very important, but it's not the whole story, and I want to elaborate on that in different ways. There's another dimension to all this as well in terms of setting up the problem. And that brings me back to a comment made by a colleague of mine, Michael Donnellan, at the LSE 30-odd years ago, when he said, Chris, you know, it won't be long before everyone does IR. You know, our subject is under threat, under competition, because everybody's naturally interested in the world. And what's wrong with that? And it's true. If you look at it not just in terms of people commenting on current affairs, which is a desirable and natural thing to do, you look at the other social sciences. Well, the lawyers have been present at the creation in a way, right from the beginning of the foundation of international relations, the period of moralistic, legalistic foreign policies of the 20s and 30s, which international relations was couched in terms of the hopes for international law. Historians, I'm glad to say, also do international relations, and not just now, and much more than they did, and not in the narrower sense of pure diplomatic history or of what one clerk said to another. But we have much more relaxed relations between IR and history than when I first went to the LSE, and the historians told us that we were doing the first, as James Mayle will remember, that we were doing the first draft of history until they got round to doing it properly with the archives, and that we were really journalists or journalists manqués, even worse. But I think one of the things I've been most pleased about over my career is to see, in fact, that historians have opened up more to social science, and especially in our particular area, and I work mostly on foreign policy decision making, and it's difficult sometimes to distinguish what the work that goes on in history from that which goes on in foreign policy analysis. I take that as wholly helpful. There's also historical sociology looking at the big sweep of international relations. There's an exception, of course, to the social science interest in international politics, and that's the economists. I'm afraid we can't convince the economists. They're a lost cause. They don't really want to do political economy. We've seen all the student protests. We've seen the Queen's remark to the economists at LSE, or a question about why they didn't see it coming, and so on. And, you know, they're brilliant people, but they don't really want to have much to do with us and the study of international politics. I hope that will slowly change, but it's not at the moment. They're the exception to the rule. Sociologists have become ever more interested, quite understandably, in notions of world society, global civil society. And the more you talk about international society, the more you need to talk to the sociologists and indeed the social anthropologists, and in particular areas, demographers, management studies, and so on. There's lots of room for effective cooperation, although I'm myself a bit dubious, since you allow me to air my prejudices, a bit dubious about some of the mantras of interdisciplinarity. I think we often just have a pluridisciplinarity. We do things in parallel and pretend that we're cooperating, and we're forced sometimes by the powers that be into cooperation which doesn't come naturally intellectually, but still, there you go. And lastly, I bring myself to political science, which is, you know, to some extent my own discipline. I've got one foot in it anyway. a lot of work about politics, in my experience, a lot of books about politics have been interested naturally in the external dimension. You'd have to be pretty daft not to be. But very often a political science book on a country, in the days when people wrote about countries, they don't very much these days, but still, the external thing would be the last chapter, sort of tacked on. We've got to kind of tick that box. But it wasn't integrated with the analysis. Well, things have changed over the last 20 years a bit on that. But we now have a growth in public policy, and it's one of the achievements of Polis in recent years, and David has done a lot to carry it forward in his time ahead of department, that we've got the public policy programme, we're probably going to have a chair, and that the area is going to expand and so on. But public policy should include international public policy, external relations. Foreign policy is public policy, by the way, although you wouldn't know that from looking at most syllabi on the subjects. So I hope that over the development of public policy, we will see an interest in some of the things which, not just the narrow traditional forms of external relations, but the wider form of it too. So I conclude by and large that we've got all these social scientists doing international relations, but we're not at the point where we can afford just to take the IS out of Polis, let alone the PIS out of Polis, because international studies is still a very important part of our understanding of politics, and it has a distinctive quality to it. Let me give you a short case study, and that's of the European migration crisis, which I'm very concerned with, like all of us as citizens, with at the moment. Now, most people watching it on TV or reading the newspapers will understandably think that it's basically one ball of wax. It's one set of problems, from Calais to Lesbos and points north and south as well. And the European Union, of course, is trying to take a holistic view of the thing. There's not yet a global approach to migration, but the European Union often uses the word global when it means really European, but still, it's trying understandably and desperately to come up with an overarching approach, and it's failing. It's failing for reasons which those of us who study these things, and perhaps plenty who don't, understand. Member states are defecting or even preventing common policy. The instinct of sauve-qui-peut is politically the most dominant factor on view. Germany, supposedly exercising leadership, the most important country in the Union, or in the Eurozone particularly, has indeed exercised leadership, but not leadership very well coordinated with its fellow member states. Mrs. Merkel's, in some ways, admirable demonstration of her good-heartedness in saying that everyone could come to Germany has been paralleled, which had lots of unintended consequences, of course, has been followed by more or less unilateral or bilateral diplomacy with Turkey, which has also caused quite significant complications for other member states, with a kind of reverse domino effect of people putting up borders and not being happy with what's going on, and the moral objections to the relationship with Turkey because of what's going on under Erdogan's watch, and all the rest of it. What is more, the populist movements that we have seen in Europe over the last 5 to 10 years have been given a very significant boost by what has been happening recently. That's not to say that a generous and open-hearted approach to the refugees coming from the tragic Syrian war shouldn't have been taken, but it is at least a plea for an intelligent and politically coordinated approach, if at all possible, and as far as I'm aware, very strong efforts are being made to do this, but against enormous obstacles. The migrants themselves naturally see Europe as a safe haven, and if I lived in Syria or even Lebanon or in a Palestinian refugee camp, it's interesting that nobody talks about the Palestinians in their camps, and that because the Palestinians want to stay near their homeland and they're not under barrel bombing, so they have got a slightly different problem. But it's not totally dissimilar either. And if I were living in those environments, I would see the European Union as a safe haven and hope to be able to get there, not necessarily for reasons I'll come to a bit later, but I could well understand that they would want to. But they also know that it makes a huge difference as to which member state they might end up in, or which they have preferences about which member state they go to. And these preferences are not just trivial. I like Swedish films or something like that. They know that there are places where the welfare provisions are better, or where the opportunities for learning a language, or where they might be able to reunite with their family or whatever. These are very serious differences, even within the European Union, in terms of member states welcoming. And I think that shows that we need to attend to the different levels of the policy-making process when we try and come up with solutions. Is asking a lot, but ways forward in relation to this very difficult problem. And when you think about it, there are people in this department who've operated at the personal level, who've gone to Calais or gone to Lesbos to try and help out. That is what people can do in the modern world. It's absolutely admirable that people want to help and are able to help directly. But it won't be enough on its own, of course. It's a sticking plaster. It's a palliative approach. Then there's the national approach. Well, the British who were responsible in part for the Iraq War, and who were bombing Syria, and who were on the game in the Afghanistan war. And we are pulling up the drawbridge and saying, no, the consequences of this in terms of the movement of people and refugees is not for us, really. It's for the European continent. The Greeks and the Italians got to get their act together and so on. There's something predictable politically about that, but not very admirable. And the EU level I've already mentioned. At the international global level, one might think that in the longer term, we need to work at the Convention on Refugees, the asylum procedures and rules. Are they appropriate? Are they fit for purpose in the changed conditions in which we find ourselves? At the very least, there are vastly more people who see themselves as in need of, let's call it asylum technically, or refugee. If we just call it refuge, it can be for economic want as well as, of course, from freedom from war. And in many ways, economic want can be just as devastating as the fear of war. So we need to do collectively some thinking, the lawyers, the political scientists, and of course the policy world, in order to work out that. But two conclusions I draw. One is that the international is itself a different realm of activity, and two, there are, in the jargon of the term, there's multi-level governance going on within that, which penetrates also into individual states. Now, in terms of developments in academic IR over the last, over the time of my career, I suppose, which started in October 1974 at the LSE, there have been movements which have both helped and hindered in terms of coming to terms with the international. At the level of normative international relations, which didn't really exist as a field when I started, that is to say, interest in moral judgments, the values underlying our attitudes to policy and our real world policies and so on. That has developed, and it has grown in conjunction, or it's grown closer to political theory, classical political theory, the kind that David and others do. And I don't know whether you would say that there's a nearly unified field, but clearly if you're interested in problems of justice and responsibility and rights, you want to think about that at the international level as well as the domestic. And if you only try to do it in the domestic context, you're going to miss quite a lot given the nature of the modern world. So that's one area in which convergence has been obvious and to some extent has led to a blurring of some of the things that I've been talking about. But perhaps more powerful in this respect has been the empirical work, the interest in general themes like conflict resolution, democratization, globalization particularly, which were overarching and in which the state or the differences between states and cultures seemed to almost disappear. And sometimes this was done deliberately. I mean, Rob Walker's famous book on Inside Out was really a contestation of the very idea that there should be a demarcation, or at least wanted to move it in into a different sort of place. And I think it's good to contest and to interrogate these demarcations, but there was too much impatience with state-centric understandings of international relations. The baby was very nearly thrown out with the bathwater. Now, my esteemed predecessor and friend and colleague James Mail said about 15 years ago, the international is an even more elusive category than the national interest. And certainly I have no time for the notion of the national interest as a category. But I think he would agree with another of our colleagues, Andrew Hurrell, who said that the international environment has a mixed, hybrid and contested character. And Elisabetta Brighi, a close colleague of mine in the area of foreign policy analysis, has said the international is an uneven terrain on which to practice politics. And I think I identify, well, I think we did use that phrase in a joint article actually, so I must agree with it. That's very much how I see the international terrain is pretty uneven, even more uneven than the individual national terrains. And Justin Rosenberg gave the Carr lecture last November in Aberystwyth, and he has said that the key defining characteristic of the international is what he calls multiplicity. I would call it diversity. I mean, there is a spectrum because, as David said, I've worked on multiculturalism. That's about diversity within society. But there is no doubt there is still a hell of a lot of diversity at the international level. And one of the things that characterizes a national community, or indeed any other kind of community, is a certain degree of homogeneity. Not perfect, but nonetheless an area where a quantitative difference probably amounts to a qualitative one. And I think that we need to be aware of that and not allow these holistic and homogenizing ideas like globalization or conflict resolution to obscure the nature of differences. There's a tendency to fall back on binaries, and in IR we've done it a lot between the international anarchy and the society of states. It doesn't really work. It's a useful heuristic device, but it doesn't truly work. In the world of in the Muslim world, there's been a traditional distinction between the Dar al-Islam, the world of faith, and the Dar al-Harb, the world of war. And most, I think, Muslim scholars don't think that stands up either, and that one has to have ways of distinguishing relationships between people with whom you're not absolutely buddies and people with whom you're not either at war. So we need to have a more fine-grained approach to understanding international relations. Now, my view is that we have actually in international relations managed to make progress over the last 40 years. It just happens to be a coincidence. It coincides with my career, of course. I don't claim the credit for this. But we have made progress, and at the same time, we have a more refined idea of the international, but we quite justifiably still have an idea of the international's difference. And in order to link the personal to the political here, let me just indulge myself with a touch of autobiography, as I said in the advance notice for this lecture, which may have put some people off or may have brought some people here, I don't know. Basically, like most people of my generation, I didn't do international relations as an undergraduate. I didn't even know there was such a subject, to tell you the truth, until quite late on in my 3 years as a postgraduate at Oxford. I did modern history, and I did a BPhil, a coursework on a BPhil in politics. And because I was interested in decision-making, foreign policy decision-making, I mostly did political sociology, political theory, public administration. And so IR didn't figure. I mean, at Oxford at that time, there was Professor Michael Howard, who was brilliant. He became the titular professor of the history of war, who was an absolutely inspiring figure, and he drew people like Laurie Freedman to Oxford. But there was nobody else, really. There were a couple of decent historians, but on the books, as it were, doing teaching in the colleges. But there was nothing in terms of an intellectual centre of international relations. And yet Oxford is now a very big centre. It's got 18 full-time IR people. It's got a Department of Politics and IR, which is knocking on 90 staff, I think, all told. It's powerful. It's got a lot of resources. And it led Martin Keedle in a recent book on the study of politics at Oxford to say slightly crowingly that Cambridge had established a good lead over Oxford. Oxford had established Freudian slip. Oxford had established a good lead over Cambridge in the study of international relations by the early part of this current century. I was fortunate in being at Nuffield College, which didn't do international relations either, but I came across some fellow students like Miles Kaler and Laurie Freedman and some very open-minded historians. They might not recognise themselves in that term, like Alan Knight and John Darwin and Martin Keedle, who were interested in things international, although still the IR literature was pretty much unknown to me. And it was only when actually I was fortunate enough to get a job at LSE, which I couldn't possibly have done in these days without being qualified in the subject and without even having finished my DPhil, that I found myself learning IR a few weeks ahead of the student. A very salutary experience, actually, which some of you in this audience perhaps also have experienced. So I then went to LSE and found myself studying the subject, and it was, as I say, and teaching it, and it was a time at which the focus was really in the mid-70s, October 74, on strategic studies and military things, but not military techniques and technology, how to think about nuclear deterrence, particularly a brilliant guy called Philip Windsor who held everybody in thrall as he explained nuclear deterrence to them. And I went back for this lecture, and this is my only slide, or two, they go together, to look at the LSE syllabus of that year. This is part 2, the second and third year, quite comparable to what we do at Cambridge, I suppose. So you get 4 compulsory papers, a history paper taught mostly by the historians, international politics, the nature of the international system, that was foreign policy analysis. I had forgotten that it was already there when I arrived. I had persuaded myself I invented it, but actually it's not true, I didn't. And international institutions, we'd call them international organisation these days. And then quite a decent choice of optional papers, those which were regarded as sort of half in the department, like international law, a very distinguished international lawyer like Ros Higgins taught it, who then went on to the World Court. Well, the sociology of international law she taught, and there was international law which you could do. Theories of international politics, with Michael Banks was quite advanced in doing all that, and something called the politics of international economic relations, which James was involved in and which became international political economy and the strategic studies I've mentioned. And then special periods. So there was some cooperation with the historians. It was pretty iffy cooperation, but the students benefited anyway, and they could do optional papers like this, or an essay, or an approved subject from sociology or whatever. Now, I give you this partly just out of nostalgia, partly because I think it stands up actually surprisingly well, but also to ask you collectively, especially those of you who are in the department and maybe thinking how IR would develop in policy in the future. I mean, it's not in the near future. We're never going to have an IR tripos. We're going to be a struggle to get a politics and IR tripos, but that would be a sensible aim for the medium term. At that point, we need to ask ourselves, well, what should be on the syllabus then? You know, I mean, it doesn't matter about labels and names, but what's the actual content? Is there anything truly distinctively international that has to be studied, or can it always be studied under the heading of political science, as I suggested some people would want us to do earlier? And Cambridge, of course, has been doing international relations in some form since, I think, 1967, and then the MPhil starting in 79, was it, I think, Charles and Philip, about the late 70s anyway. And my understanding was that it was a pretty informal business until particularly Philip Towell and then Ian Clarke and others professionalised it, and James arrived as the first chair. There was no chair until 1998. So Cambridge, and no undergraduate paper until I had the honour of giving one on international relations from 2010 onwards. So really, international relations at Cambridge was a bit behind Oxford. It was well behind the LSE. And one of the things that I hope that you will do in the future is to take the start that's been made over the last 20 years and develop it. And I think it will be helped. And this is not at all, I don't wish to argue at all that there is a sort of an antagonism or a tension between the politics and international studies side of the department. They need each other, but they also need to understand what each side is bringing to the party, as it were, and where the possible demarcation lines might be. Let me rush on a bit. The subject, anyway, if this is what it was like in the mid-70s, it actually soon developed, and a lot of people would have regarded and did regard that as a rather traditional approach, because there was an efflorescence of special subjects of interest in gender and constructivism and, of course, the postmodern wave and specialist interests, some links with area studies and so on. The whole thing exploded in the 80s and 90s. Huge student demand, which continues. Students are interested in international relations, and there's a very good reason for that, which goes beyond trying to get jobs and because they come from many different countries and they want to be able to say that they're international in their outlook. It's because they know there are some very significant dilemmas with which to wrestle, on top of the ones that exist within the individual countries in which they're interested. And I have no time to go over the details of what happened in IR in those years, the 80s, 90s, and indeed after 9/11. But what I can say is that in the 1990s, there was this, as I referred earlier to, I think, this unleashing of homogenizing ideas, particularly globalization, but also things like responsibility to protect, the human rights discourse, which seemed to be becoming accepted. Let's not talk about the end of history, which most of us have done to death, but it was interesting that nobody actually at the time wrote something I think called the end of international relations, because you might have thought with the collapse of communism and bipolarity in the Cold War that, you know, maybe, and people were saying no more war, maybe international relations stopped being a subject. Actually, we found out on 9/11 that it wasn't. So whereas strategic studies and the study of nuclear deterrence fell off the edge of a cliff after 1990, nobody wanted to do it. People had trouble keeping their jobs almost. Then suddenly after 9/11, bang, everything, the gears crash into reverse. And we're all security now, terrorism, foreign policy. You know, fortunately, I published a book on foreign policy, thanks to my colleague here from Palgrave, Stephen Kennedy, in 2002. I mean, I've been working on it for some time, of course, like most books, but still, and he'd been very patient with me. But it came out at the right moment, and the only thing I've ever made any money out of. Not enough, but still. A bit of money, paid for a couple of holidays. But that's not healthy. It's not healthy in our subject if we go into reverse, if we fall into these binaries. You know, the world is suddenly one, or no, the world is not. The world, we're back to a realm of fear and danger and so on. It's just not the way, actually, the literature and the research that's been done over a number of different subjects tell us how things are, apart from probably our common sense. So we need somehow to reconcile these two different sorts of things that are going on. The things which have a global and maybe a universalizing tendency, whether it's ideas or technology or morals, and those things which are the dialectic which is fighting against it, which may be expressed in the purely domestic. The United States culture is very different from Canadian, and so on, and the very different historical experience. I may return one of the compliments, David, because your little book on politics, which should be read by almost every sixth former and people older than that too, makes this contrast between life in Syria and life in Denmark. You know, well, it's pretty different, obviously, but even before the Civil War, it was pretty different under Assad. It makes a difference where you live, and that politics, it may not be 100% of the explanation, but it's a pretty important part of what's going on. And what's more, the politics is not just internal. You know, the international politics of Denmark's relationship with the EU is very important, and with NATO, and with the Baltics, and with the Nordics, is very important. But Syria's antagonistic relationship with Israel, its more friendly relationship with Hezbollah or with Iran, that is also a crucial part of why Assad is in power. And it's that interplay that one has to understand, I think. Now, time, as it usually does in my lecture, seems to run away very quickly. I just want to make a few remarks under some different headings, a couple thematic and a couple more human. The first thematic idea is related to this idea of security, which seems to be at the heart of the study of international relations. And I think no serious IR person should abandon it. I mean, we can have our ideas. We teach try to teach the complexity of understanding the causes of war and so on, and what the nature of the security threats are. But in the modern IR environment, we need to ask ourselves, well, you know, how far is the element of danger and risk that exists in international relations indiscriminate? How far does it vary according to which parts of the system? And what are the variables, if you like, which help it to be a bit more stable and peaceful in certain places than in others, building on the country comparison. I was interested to read recently an article, a short article, because politicians only write short articles, by Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos in Spain. And he said, it's only by studying international politics that you really understand what politics is about. It's, in other words, you know, it's the Hobbesian war of all against all. It's a rough old business. People behave ruthlessly. Well, I would have thought a left-wing leader might be a bit more optimistic about that. And I'd understand what he means. He's looking at what's happened to Syriza and the exercise of German power in Greece and so on. And so, you know, it's tough. We're going to have a very steep uphill climb to achieve anything in Spain. But I think he's wrong, really, in thinking that politics, that even IR is always that kind of very hard-edged world of steel and antagonism. And the European environment, the European Union, which Spain is still desperate to remain in, is the best example of the fact that one can find reinforcing elements in the environment which help your own country's development to take place. After all, Greece, which many people regretted allowing into the EU, of course, in 1981, and then Spain and Portugal, were basically all encouraged to join in order to try and stabilise those countries' politics in their post-dictatorship world. So the two things were brought together. It might have been a mistake. I have my criticisms of enlargement to make myself, although not those three particularly. But that's the kind of trade-offs that always have to be borne in mind. And there are two meanings, in my view, of the external, call it the international, the external. Go back to my subject. One is the purely concrete. You might have an external threat or a problem or a concern. You're worried about rising sea levels if you're in the Maldives or whatever it is. You can put a number on it. But then there's the external in the broader sense of things outside your control. You actually live in a system over which no one, even the hyperpuissance of the United States, can actually call all the shots, or even the most important shots compared relating to their own interests. Look at how the United States, time without number, has tried to move things on in the Middle East, which it regards as an area of vital interest, and failed because of the sheer intractability of the environment. And that's not to say that one should be fatalistic or that, you know, it's just great historical forces unrolling. There are Clausewitzian issues here of choice and risk and strategy and politics to be undertaken. But one has to understand, as we used to say in the old days, the constraints and the opportunities also, rather than going full steam ahead with one particularly dominant idea. Another theme I'd just like to say a little about is the notion of the good life. And here I'm treading on the territory of the political theorists. Political theory classically is about how the good life might be achieved within a given polity. And if we ask ourselves that question in international relations, whose good life actually should we be concerned with if it's a normative question? The whole 7 billion of the world's planet? At what level might we be able to make a difference if we take that reference group? And it's difficult to say not, you know, that we should just be selfish, concerned, be concerned with our own nation or our like-minded people or whatever, or conversely, that we should concentrate on, say, the bottom billion, the poorest of the poor, and make sure that, you know, that everything else in the kind of middle ground has to look after itself. The rich can look after themselves, the very poor need looking after, the kind of Paul Collier approach in a way, and then, you know, there's a big middle though, there's a huge middle between of 5 to 6 billion people probably in the world, and we have to think about what might be achievable for them, or is it basically a matter of autonomy and that we must allow people to work through their own imagined communities and find what fate they can? Well, there are some areas, of course, in which we have to attend to the broad conditions which affect us all, climate change being the most obvious, or the international economy, where we're worried about recession and so on. But probably the most we can hope for there is to make some progress on a broad set, within broad parameters, and then just have to accept that individual players within the system will still make choices, even if they can agree to stick within those parameters. They can stay with the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement of last December. You know, that's not very much, but it's better than nothing. But there will be plenty who are tempted even not to sign up, like not to sign up to non-proliferation treaty, not to sign up to climate accords, or once they've signed up to defect from them. So this is very, very difficult to imagine. There is a very profound difference between building, on the one hand, a decent and successful society from people bound together by law and territory, and I've forgotten who actually said that, but it's a good quote, I think. That's very different from the task of building civilized relations between separate societies. And both of those we have to do somehow. If we neglect one, well, certainly if we neglect civilized relations between separate societies, which is the international, we could risk nuclear war, we could risk climate disaster, we could risk what happened in 1929, the great crash and the political consequences that followed from all that. And there was no hotline, don't forget, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The hotline between Moscow and Washington arrived as a result of the world coming very close to nuclear war. So we have to attend to the mechanisms which are needed to provide the minimal conditions of civilized life between people. And at the same time, naturally, most of us are concerned with trying to build not just a good life, a decent life for our own country, but probably our own city, and our own family, ultimately. And it's those levels which we have to somehow juggle politically, or that our leaders on our behalf have to juggle them. But I think can be called a category mistake if we think that they're the same question, building civilized relations between separate countries on the one hand, or separate communities on the one hand, and building a good life within a given society on the other. So really the old question of coexistence is still there at the heart of international relations, but it's a question of the terms of coexistence in changing conditions. What kind of, is it just minimalist coexistence, or can we build on top of that, as I would hope, to create a slightly denser and thicker web of agreements on a number of things? Because we can't, whether we like it or not, as moral beings, but also in modern conditions, opt out from being concerned with the fate of others in other societies. It's part of our modern consciousness, facilitated by information technology and all the rest of it. But there's no going back on that. So it's simply a question of in what way can we actually do good as opposed to making ourselves feel good. And one of my prejudices is that there is an awful lot of grandstanding going on and not a lot of serious political work. In my foreign policy book, I have at the beginning of it, as some of you might know, the famous quote from Max Weber, that politics is the slow drilling of hard boards. And that is something I profoundly believe. It doesn't mean that one should be negative or realist or state-centric or whatever. It is just a cautionary tale about the importance of prudence. Let me come towards the end and just say something about the actual human level, what it means to live in the international and to experience it, and how we all cope with it. There's a lot of talk about ordinary people in international relations. When people do that, it always seems to imply that they are extraordinary. Everybody else who's not ordinary is extraordinary. Well, we're all extraordinary, and we're all ordinary, of course. You know, we are all data on a social science database, and at the same time, we're all individually unique, and we have to somehow cope with both of those facts in our head at the same time. And of course, ordinary citizens, especially those in rich countries, have more opportunities to take part in the opportunities of the world than they perhaps have ever done before. They can travel more easily. I can see a friend of mine in the audience who used to babysit his grandchild in New Zealand while the mother took a shower by Skype. And you know, this is kind of completely unimaginable for even my generation growing up in the middle part of the last century. There's the people like us, I'm not going to do this actually when I retire, but the baby boomers take the grey pound or the grey euro on cruises all over the world, not participating in countries very much. I know some of my colleagues lecture on these things, that's fine. But you know, I know a little bit about central Italy, Tuscany, and I know that Florence is more or less a wonderful city. One of the great parts of our patrimony is more or less ruined by human pollution. And a lot of it comes by huge cruise ships docking in Livorno, dumping their thousands, literally thousands of people into coaches, who then drive up the Superstrada to Florence, spend 2 hours in the city gawping, spending about €5 each on a postcard or something, back to the cruise ship. You know, is that the experience of the International? No, really. That's making money, or ticking a box, or taking a photograph, a selfie to show that you've been there. You know, it's not really the International experience. It's well known, on the other side of the coin, it's a well-known fact, of course, that some people don't like even to do that. Only 40% of Americans have passports, although I gather the number is growing. It used to be 10 years ago, it was less than 30%. So that's good, I suppose. There's a kind of understanding of the world. Because quite a lot of people actually, even in this globalized environment, like their roots. There was a fascinating article I read recently in The World Today by a filmmaker called Holly Morris, who went back to Chernobyl in the Ukraine 30 years after the devastating nuclear explosion. And she found some very interesting conclusions. That there were a group of babushkas, the grandmothers, who had stayed. They had been nobody could force them to leave. I mean, I think in the short run they were probably forced to leave, but they came back. They wanted. They made a choice. We're going to stay in our village. And amazingly, their longevity proved to be greater than their colleagues who had gone to live in a miserable council flat in Kiev, because these people had been uprooted and they were sad. They were lacking their community. And yet somehow these other old ladies, it's often ladies actually rather than men. I don't know whether men went to fight or something, but anyway, the babushkas, they somehow seem to have survived the radiation. You know, is it that the immune system is given a boost by love of one's group or one's place or whatever? It's an interesting conclusion. And Holly Morris says, it is difficult for Westerners with deeper connections to their laptops than to any piece of soil to understand this. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I did some work, and admittedly it's about the Second World War, so you could argue that times have gone on since then. But I did some work on a French peasant who was captured by the Germans in the Vosges in May 1940, and spent his time on a German Arbeitskommando. And he wrote diaries because he didn't like playing cards. And the only thing he could think of was really, understandably, getting back to his Petite Vigne, his little vineyard in the Languedoc. And of course, he never left. And this was an intelligent guy who enjoyed seeing Reims Cathedral and all the rest of it, but he never wanted to leave. Even more interestingly, because I still get Christmas cards from his family and so on after we did this book, his family are still in the same area, despite the problems of employment for the younger generation in the region. You know, and I've found the same in New England or in Tuscany. There are lots of people who, even in these modern conditions, actually like to be aware of the world, but they don't necessarily want to live the kind of cosmopolitan life that probably most people in this audience enjoy. And we're on that escalator, we can't get off it. There you go. Migrants, even the poor migrants that we've been seeing and I talked about earlier, they don't necessarily want to leave their environment. In fact, some of the younger and bolder ones, no doubt, want to take the opportunity of a new life and so on. But many of them, most of them probably, are driven by extremely difficult situations in their home countries, whether economic or political. And once they enter into the environment, the international environment, they come up against the power of the state, the power of borders, security systems, regulations, simply trying to get papers, trying to get a job, trying to get your family together. I mean, this is not a level playing field. This is not an open playing field in which people can move around the world freely. And this isn't just since 9/11 and the worry about terrorism and all the rest of it. It is the nature of the world in which we live. Now, I'm going to come to an end. You've heard quite enough. I think you've got the message, I hope, by now. Let me just say a little bit to come back to the academic, the IR in caps as opposed to the small IR. I'm a member still for another few months of the Department of Politics and International Studies. So we're doing international relations, we're doing political theory, we're doing comparative politics, doing lots of very interesting things. And it's been wonderful to see over the last 7 years since the department started how it's grown, and it's going from strength to strength. And there's a huge amount of enthusiasm and a very talented bunch of young staff and researchers and so on. So what we need, I think, is actually not to merge into a department, whatever you called it. You could call it international politics, you could of course call it politics, but to continue this work that we're doing in harness, where we accept that there'll be lots of blurred lines between us, there'll be lots of overlaps, lots of collaborations, but there are also differences of category. And I meant to say something earlier which epitomizes my argument really, which is that although there are lots of problems which we have in common, there is also a difference between contexts. Context makes a huge difference. Not even just political context, but cultural context. And I suppose that's in IR, in social science jargon, it's agency and structure and so on. It is the environment versus the players who are in that environment. Comparative politics, for example, which in a way I do by doing comparative foreign policy, is very good at showing us the variety of the world, varieties of capitalism, varieties of types of the ship of state. But only IR, I think, charts the nature of the sea and its currents and talks about the kinds of particular skills that might be necessary in which to survive in this rather unpredictable, shall we say, not always dangerous, but unpredictable environment of the overall system, which has hidden depths as well as difficult currents. When we study this, we need our impact not to be what the ref wants it to be, which is a ridiculous attempt to measure whether or not we've actually made a concrete difference to society or policy, which is actually a deeply naive approach to what we do. But what we need to do is to have impact over the longer term, over the way in which people think about their world, how they understand the problems that they're dealing with, the environments in which they live, the interrelations between the different kinds of actors that there are in the world, the different levels of decision making, the competing moral claims. Because it's the job of political theory, whether it's international political theory or more local, to sift the differing moral claims and work out what can be done on what basis. Not necessarily empirically, of course, you need the philosophers at base, but that's what it ultimately amounts to. And I think we have seen in the history of international relations too much tragedy created by oversimplification of ideas, of political obsessions, of hubris, going back to the phrase that I referred to earlier on. I hope to have convinced you anyway that there's a great deal of content still left in the international. I'm going to end, if I may, with 2 more minutes, David, by just indulging myself in one further little treat. That is to say, giving a few homilies, which are almost like bullet points, but I'm not going to put them up as bullet points. Because to abuse the phrase of the great Primo Levi, if not now, when? This is my last chance, my last few minutes of a formal lecture at Cambridge, although I hope somebody will invite me to talk on other things later on, but still. First of all, let's not sink so far into the morass of specialization and scholasticism, which IR, as much as anything else, is tempted by, that we don't ask the big questions. As I've said, IR should provide a holistic view as well as detailed research and expertise. I think we can't do without history. In our department, we have said that many IR departments are going down the road of, not the scientific method or what somebody called physics envy, that we dealt with that some years ago, but rational choice approaches derived from economics and bargaining theory and so on. Often interesting, often arid. And I think many of us in this department think that a historical understanding, rather than doing history, is absolutely critical to be able to do international relations properly. And if other UK departments want to go down a different road, so much the worse for them. We have a comparative advantage and we should have the confidence to stay with it. And we've got a very powerful history department which here in this university which appears to want to cooperate with us. We're starting a new tripos in history and politics. And my understanding, I'm not really a Cambridge person, as you know, I've only been here 12 years and you need about 150 to be accepted. But in Florence it's 200, by the way, but still. You know, this is virtually the first time it's been able to do a joint degree, isn't it? You know, Cambridge has set its face against them in the past, but this is a tremendously good development, I think. Thirdly, I think we've got to do normative international theory. It's one of the great things that's developed over the course of my career. I don't do it so much myself, but I don't think it should exist in a theoretical cloister. I think it needs integrating with foreign policy analysis, like Michael Walzer in a way has done, international politics, the study of international organisation. Thinking about priorities and values is important in any area of international relations. Penultimately, my own particular hobby horse, we should not marginalise the study of decision-making, not just foreign policy decision-making, but all kinds of decision-making, international organisations, as local areas as well. The Chilcot report, it is said, when it ever gets published, and the latest information is that it's probably going to be buried under the Brexit referendum, either just before or just after, but it's going to be 2 million words, you know, 20 plus PhD theses, a lot of good material there, and indeed some of us are planning to use some of it. Like the Pentagon Papers, and the new material coming out of Russian archives, it's going to be a real treasure trove for trying to get to grips with what politicians do without having to wait 30 years for the archives, which have already been anyway Baudelarized and laundered before you even get to them. So this, I think, well, we've already got a lot of the hearings on the web, so this will be vital. And I hope plenty of people will dig into them. And lastly, this is my last word you'll be glad to hear. Even if international relations is indeed a very difficult, if not the most difficult, arena in which politics gets practiced, over the 42 years of my career, it has also become a realm of hope and possibility without reverting to simple-minded utopianism, which did characterize some of the period in the 1920s and 1930s. So we have hope and possibility on the one hand and danger on the other. It's the conjunction of these two things, I think, which give our subject its critical importance.